series of talks on the text Transforming Problems into Happiness by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And I found these teachings incredibly beneficial for my mind, and have been thinking about them since then. And especially, it's a book that's a commentary on another text, a much shorter text, called Transforming Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment by Dedupchen Jigme Tempa Nima. And this is a text that I keep going back to again and again. It's very short, and it just explains how to take suffering onto the path so incredibly clearly. So I have found myself, whenever I'm unhappy or there's some problem, I just read this text. So I wanted to do a little bit of a Cliff Notes version of it, because I've been doing this in my practice, and it's been incredibly helpful recently. So the text starts with this section called Dropping the Attitude of Being Entirely Unwilling to Suffer. So this is basically accepting suffering. And he says that it's useless to see suffering as unfavorable. It's true. And he takes a lot of what he says from Shantideva. He's very much inspired by Shantideva. And so we all know the verse in Shantideva where Shantideva is saying that if you can do something about a problem, why be unhappy about it? Just do it. And if you can't do something about a problem, again, why be unhappy? It doesn't help to be unhappy. So I've heard this advice over and over again, and sometimes I can't quite get it. It's like, well, yes, but if it were that easy to do, then I wouldn't be unhappy. And what I've thought about was, first, okay, if there is something to do externally, we do it, but we need to check our motivation for why we're doing it, and make sure that whatever external change we're trying to implement is in alignment with the Dharma. And the other thing to do is, often I hear this advice and I think, oh, well, that means I can change something outside of myself. But actually the thing I need to change is right here. I need to change my mental state. So when I keep these in mind about doing external things in alignment with the Dharma, and primarily changing my mental state, then this advice makes so much sense. The other aspect of dropping this attitude of being entirely unwilling to suffer is seeing suffering as unfavorable causes trouble. Yes, it does. And he says if our mind is dominated by negativity, then even tiny problems become extremely difficult. Yes, they do. I will say in my life, I have experienced very little physical suffering. I've been extremely fortunate in that regard. And my suffering has primarily been mental, and essentially just my mind being untamed, uncontrolled. Taking these teeny tiny little things that anyone who looks at my life from the outside would say, that's not a thing at all. That's not a big deal. That's not even a deal. What's your problem? My problem is my uncontrolled mind. I take ownership of that. And so basically to ask ourselves, like, am I making this worse by ruminating on it, by bringing it up in my mind daily? You know, because I do that with some tiny problems I have. And just to really see, is this causing me trouble? Is this exacerbating the problems that I have? Okay, so that's the first section about accepting suffering, being willing to suffer. The next step, which is a little more advanced, or a lot advanced, is cultivating the attitude of being joyful when suffering arises. So we know Lama Zopa Rinpoche is a fan of this and has done this. So the author here talks about ways in which we can bring suffering into the path. And he gives 7 specific practices to do. And I love it. It's so clear, and he says exactly what to do in each one of these. So I'm not going to just read the text. We can put the link to the text in the description of this. But essentially, when I looked at this, it's essentially interweaving our suffering with the Lam Rim. And many of the topics in the Lam Rim are included here. And so I reordered them a little bit to sort of follow the Lam Rim outline. And basically, the first step, from my perspective, is to overcome the arrogance that thinks we're in control, that thinks we can control what happens to us and how we feel about it, and to say, well, actually, no, I'm not in control of the situation, and I'm definitely not in control of my mind. So that overcomes arrogance. And then the next is, once we're not so arrogant, thinking we can control things, then seeing that we need help. And where do we get help but from the Buddha Dharma Sangha? So that's taking refuge. So seeing that the only thing reliable in my life is the Buddha Dharma Sangha. And so I want to follow the Dharma. The next is seeing that suffering comes from negativity. Then we want to purify our negativity. So this encourages us to do purification. The next is seeing that happiness comes from virtue. Then we want to do virtue. And when we recognize that this suffering that I'm experiencing right now, this is just the nature of samsara. There's nothing special about me or about this particular way that I'm feeling. This is simply the nature of things. And so then we can really generate this heartfelt wish to get out of this situation that we're in, this uncontrolled situation of experiencing unsatisfactoriness and pain. And so generating renunciation and the determination to be free. And then seeing that, okay, I'm suffering now, but others are just like me in suffering, so we generate compassion. And then seeing that, as we all know, that our suffering comes from self-cherishing, self-centeredness. And so to see that cherishing others is really the antidote to that. So that's the whole Lam Rim, taking our suffering onto the path. I was thinking that this is in the genre of thought transformation. And I was thinking that thought transformation makes absolutely no sense when we're clinging to worldly goals, right? When we still are caught up in the 8 worldly concerns, then these really are problems because they're blocking me from having possessions and getting a good reputation and having someone praise me and getting comfort. But when we switch our orientation and start looking at things from the perspective of, what do I want spiritually? Well, I want to cultivate the causes for a good rebirth. I want to generate renunciation. I want to generate bodhicitta, progress along the path. When that's our orientation, then the same situation is not a problem, right? So it's a matter of orientation. And I was also thinking that for these really to be effective, we really have to understand why this particular issue is beneficial, right? This is the whole key to thought training, is changing our perspective, seeing that what we were considering to be a problem is actually helpful to us. So some of the ways that some of the unhelpful mental states and the pain caused by those are helpful is that they keep me interested in spiritual practice and curious about how my mind is thinking. You know, if I have some mental unhappiness, I'm thinking, I am not thinking clearly. I'm not thinking correctly in this moment. So I stay curious about what's going on. it gives me a lot of energy as I'm experiencing right now to do the same practice and the same antidote daily, every day coming back to this antidote, because I know this is what I need. And so I have this energy. It's like, oh yeah, this caused me suffering yesterday. I'm really enthusiastic about cultivating the antidote to it today, and just keep doing that. And it really opens my heart, and I can see, I mean, I don't have equanimity, but it opens my heart to those who are suffering in the same kinds of ways. I can see that there's like this heart connection, like, oh, I know what that's like. Um, and so the author here says there's a few ways in order to do this, to engage in these kinds of practices. One, and this is things we've all heard before, we need to make it familiar. So we need to engage in these prior to the problem. So I've made this mistake for a year, basically coming to this text only when I had an active problem. And so recently I've been just reviewing it constantly before something more major arises. Also, a key component to this is he calls it appreciation of our achievement. So when we recognize that we turned our mind, to rejoice in that. In my last BBC, I talked about my daily practice of rejoicing, and I'm finding it extremely beneficial, just to keep my mind uplifted. And he gives this very cute, sweet analogy. He says, this is a paraphrase, but that when we engage in this practice, it's bitter yet sweet, like the Indian cakes made with sugar mixed with cardamom and pepper. And that to me is
This is a guided meditation on peace, presentness, and political revolution. Find a place where you can sit comfortably, perhaps resting your hands on your knees. You may wish to sit on the floor with your legs crossed. Or, if you're not too tired, you may like to lie down on your back. Whatever position suits you. Make sure that your chest is open, and you may wish to allow your eyes to gently close, or find a point in the room where you can rest your focus. Begin by noticing your breathing. Feel your chest rising and falling, your belly expanding in and out. You don't have to change the way you breathe, just becoming aware of it. In and out. Notice also that society can be thought of as being made up of groups of people with conflicting and irreconcilable economic interests, which we call classes. You don't have to change society in this moment. This is your moment, your time. Just notice class conflict and be aware of it. This will be our anchor as we proceed on this journey. And now, let's take 3 deep, relaxing breaths. As you release the air in your lungs, you may wish to repeat in your mind the topics of today's meditation. And with each breath, I invite you to experience a doubling of your relaxation. Let's take the first of these 3 breaths. Now, breathing in peace and out. Very good. Breathing normally in between, becoming even more relaxed with each breath. Let's take the second breath. Now, in presentness and release. Fantastic job. Aware of your chest rising and falling. Let's take the third and final breath. Now, breathing in political revolution and out. Well done. Don't worry if your breathing doesn't match the sound of my voice. It is all good, and it is all okay. Just becoming even more aware of breath, and beginning slowly to relax. As we breathed those 3 relaxing breaths, you may have noticed a slight tingling sensation spreading from the top of your head down through your shoulders, arms, chest, right out the tips of your toes. This sensation is available to you throughout this meditation, whenever you desire. Don't be distressed or upset if you become distracted by thoughts or sounds in the room. Just keep coming back to breath. The world can be chaotic, and we can lose focus when we think about what we might like to change, or something we wish we could control. But just invite yourself to come back to breath and the model of class conflict. Breathing in and out. As you sink deeper and deeper into this relaxed state of awareness, you may begin to notice the position of your body, the surfaces you are in contact with, the temperature of the room. And you may also notice your body's position in the system of global capitalism. And the air continues to flow, becoming even more relaxed, even more aware. Now, in this relaxed state, we are ready to consider the revolution. As you breathe in and out, receive an invitation to the idea that revolution will look different for you if you are in a bourgeois nation enriched by global capitalism. We may shy away from this image, whether because we are liberals rather than socialists, or because we were raised in liberal capitalist societies that maintain a hold on our thoughts, or perhaps out of compassion and love for our fellow human beings, whoever they may be. Whatever the reason, we may desire to avoid revolution, but simply agitate for reform within capitalist society while maintaining its comforts. But although revolution means a break with the old ways of doing things, it need not be fundamentally destructive, but instead an act of creation. It may be scary or painful, like bringing a new child into the world, but it is the birthing of a new way of life, rather than the gradual managing of decay and bargaining with entropy that liberal democracy has become. This is not to say that we cannot learn from our mistakes or come to an understanding of history. Simply that, in considering the revolution, we want our focus to be on the present and not our anxieties about the past. Do not judge yourself if you have doubts. Simply observe them and let them go. We may become anxious or depressed when we ruminate on the past and witness the destruction and pain that can seem to surround us. We can be upset by the wickedness of others and wonder how it is that human beings can have done so many awful things to each other or the planet. Conversely, we may rejoice at small changes that we have managed to win in the past through elections and trade unions in the struggle for a fairer world. But the past is not real and exists only in our memories, in the present, where breath and class conflict remain, and where we want our focus to be. Breathing in, peace, and out. Each breath deepening your relaxation and your awareness. When we are not dwelling on the past, we often project our thoughts about revolution into the future, as if it will be some messianic event, waiting just out of reach, that will save us from the frightening things in our world. But the future also does not exist. It is only anticipation in the present moment. When we think of the revolution as a specific event, like an armed uprising that will take place in the future, we can become concerned about whether our actions take us closer to our idea of that event or farther away. We may become fixated on the purity of our vision, focusing only on the ideal classless future and neglecting other forms of oppression that others struggle against in the here and now. Or we may become anxious, thinking that it is an impossible task, or that we would have nothing to contribute whether what we or those around us are doing is truly revolutionary or merely reform. It is okay to have these doubts. Simply recognize them and return to the present moment, to breath, and the desire to abolish the class system. By noticing and letting go of doubts, and not judging ourselves or others for having them, we become prepared to take and wield power in the present, to neither retreat into ruminating on how we have been hurt in the past by the current political system, nor project our desire for change onto imaginary future heroes, but instead, in the present moment, to realize the energy inside of ourselves that we can use to lead the revolution. Now, breathing in, presentness, and out. When we look at the revolution either as a distant project of the future or the redemption of the past, we often imagine it as a moral crusade, springing from the best impulses of our hearts, and someday bringing about a lasting justice. But this way of thinking can also bind us and stop us from seeing a way forward in the present. It is easy to become overwhelmed or disappointed when our own sense of justice is not met, and to become concerned with how the resources of our world are distributed, rather than the conditions under which they are extracted and produced. We stray from the present and class conflict, and it is easy to conflate our moral desire for a better world with the ideals of participation in bourgeois democracies in which we are raised. That is not to say that we must abandon our moral ideals or close our hearts to democratic participation or the suffering of others, or that our smaller efforts to make the world a better place are necessarily a misuse of our time. It is merely to appreciate that a revolution is more than a change in the distribution of goods, or a struggle to get a slightly fairer deal. It is the struggle to abolish the causes of that injustice, not merely its symptoms, which are fleeting and can flare up chaotically as long as class conflict persists. Breathing in, political revolution, and out, aware of your chest, your belly, that tingling sensation in your head, shoulders, chest, and down through your legs. You may become aware that you are holding tension in your neck, or your jaw, or cognitive tension brought about by trying to reconcile the internal contradictions of capitalism. With your next breath, just invite any tense muscles to let go. In a moment, we will count backwards from 5 and gradually return to our normal awareness. But first, take a moment to suspend yourself in this relaxed state. as if deep in an ocean, the waves sway overhead, but you are still and calm. And now we will begin to surface with 5 short phrases. You may wish to repeat them in your mind or out loud, whatever is best for you. Beginning with 5. I am aware of my breath. And now, 4. I am aware of my body, becoming more aware with each breath. 3. I am aware of class conflict, breathing in and out with 2. I am aware of the revolutionary energy inside me. And now, finally, 1. I embrace revolution in the present moment. Fantastic job. If you wish, you can stay in this relaxed state for as long as you desire. Or you may wish to continue your day renewed with this energy. Just remember to allow your awareness to always return to breath and the present moment.
So get over there after this and subscribe for great weekly socialist videos. Right, I'm gonna level with you. The world is faked. Completely, utterly faked. Young people living through the second major economic crisis of our lifetimes during the COVID-19 pandemic. Shite. Being forced to work in the gig economy or other precarious jobs with no contracts. Shite. Worker productivity increasing steadily for nearly half a century while real wages have remained stagnant. Shite. At the same time, housing, healthcare, education, and all of life's basic necessities getting more and more expensive and inaccessible for normal working people. Shite. No clear end in sight for this progressively deteriorating situation emerging from the continuing boom and bust cycles of our economy. Shite. Skyrocketing rates of mental illness among young people connected to all this. Shite. Impending climate catastrophe ensuring our days are numbered. Load of shite. So, you can see why I say the world's faked. But the good news is that we can pinpoint exactly what's causing all these problems. And not only that, we've also got the solution. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Do be a star and give this video a little share around on social media, Twitter, Discord, Facebook, etc., as the YouTube algorithm's been going really hard on this channel lately for some reason. I can't imagine why a capitalist corporation like Google, which owns YouTube, would be going hard on an openly pro-communist channel like this one. It's a real head-scratcher, but look, it is what it is. Do you remember all that FECT stuff I mentioned earlier? Do you want to know the main culprit behind it? The system of capitalism. And look, that's not to say that capitalism hasn't done some good stuff historically. It was a hugely progressive step forward from feudalism. But no system lasts forever. And if we want to solve the aforementioned problems, then it's essential that we recognise that capitalism's day has come and passed. Just like we couldn't reform feudalism to solve its inherent problems, we can't reform capitalism for the same reason. The day is past for patching up the capitalist system. It must go. It's time to move on to the next stage of historical development. Socialism. Now I know what you're going to ask next. If we're trying to achieve socialism, then why the feck are we talking about communism? The big bad scary C words that we've been taught to hate all our lives. Well, partly because it's fun to ruffle the feathers of the right-wing establishment. But more importantly because, while generally well-intentioned, no other progressive movement has ever actually succeeded in meaningfully challenging global capitalism. Ever. We've tried the social democratic route of voting the right progressive candidate into office, and time again it fails and demonstrates itself as being incapable of solving the problems that capitalism creates. Why? Because every state exists to serve the interests of its ruling class. In our case, the capitalist class. As long as the capitalist state remains intact, no amount of piecemeal reform, nor elected good guys, will ever be able to overcome the fact that the system is specifically designed to maintain the very capitalist rule that's destroying our planet. The whole thing's set up for us to fail. It's fact. Other progressives recognise this too. To their credit, there have been anarchist uprisings which genuinely sought to overthrow capitalism, and which have had some success. But the movement we call communism, specifically Marxism-Leninism and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, based on the historical materialist understanding of social historical development, has progressed us further along the path to complete liberation than anything else ever has in history. Not only have we brought about real-life socialism, but we've also progressed further beyond that first step into fighting back against the revisionist backslide into capitalism to maintain the socialist road and continue the advance towards a stateless, classless, moneyless society. Despite many errors along the way and the innumerable criticisms we must have of previous socialist experiments, the communist movement has still advanced the liberation of all working people further than anything else in history. And for that, in my opinion, it's worth carrying forward the torch of scientific socialism and the revolutionary communist tradition. To put it simply, communism works, and we've got 150 years of proletarian struggle to prove it. If you'd like to learn more about this movement, about working class revolutionary history, and about the scientific socialist path forward to collective liberation, then this series is for you. It doesn't assume any prior knowledge, so if you're still scratching your head after this video asking questions like, what is communism? Or what is socialism? But you're intrigued and want to learn more, then you're in the right place. We'll start simple with the basics of Marxism, explaining all the terminology and jargon, including a lot of the terminology used in this video, then gradually ramp things up through more intermediate and then later advanced level theory. We're going to analyse the problems of capitalism and class society more broadly, how we found ourselves neck deep in this capitalist heap of shite. But we're not just going to diagnose the problems, we're also going to map out a clear path forwards to overcome them, in line with what's been uncovered through the concrete historical experience of working class liberation struggle, all the way from the Paris Commune of 1871 to the ongoing revolutionary people's wars being waged in places like the Philippines right now on this very day. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. If you're able to support this work, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napalis, Daniel H, MLM in Practice, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Amarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Donald Christopher, Gabriel Bailey, Lepanion, Hugh Jass, The Roydway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Soup, Pontus, Colin Walsh, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, and Borku Gorilla. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without yous, and I certainly wouldn't be able to pay my bills. Cheers everyone, agus long fo. Communism. There's a lot of excitement surrounding the term, though usually as an insult rather than an accurate political descriptor. You've probably heard people like Joe Biden called one, definitely Bernie Sanders, and maybe even Donald Trump, somehow. But what is communism beyond this ill-defined boogeyman that you were taught to hate? Isn't it just when no iPhone, Vuvuzuela, 300 Carillion like you read in the YouTube comments? Well, let's find out. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist perspective. Now, there's a lot of misinformation being spread about communism by those on both the political right and the political left. So, this series seeks to demystify and clarify what it is exactly that we Marxist-Leninists and Marxist-Leninist Maoists believe in short, easily digestible videos. After this 101 series is finished, there's going to be an intermediate Socialism 201 and then an advanced Socialism 301. Now, if this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. On that note, how are you doing? My name's Paul and I am an Irish communist. But what exactly do I mean when I call myself a communist? Frederick Engels, the magnificently bearded co-author of the Communist Manifesto, wrote that communism is the doctrine of the prerequisites for the emancipation for the proletariat. A theoretical toolbox that clearly maps out how to achieve complete liberation for all working people. And this isn't just by securing free healthcare or increasing the minimum wage. In 1845, Karl Marx wrote that we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The aim is a fundamental transformation of society, which once and for all ends the exploitation of man by man. And we call the people involved in this project communists. But what's our end goal? To take away everyone's toothbrushes? No, you keep your personal property, please. The goal of communism as a movement, simply put, is to create a stateless, classless, moneyless society. That is to say, a communist society. Now, how we get there is a matter of debate among the various different sections of the political left. Some, such as anarchists, believe we can have a revolution and establish this kind of society immediately thereafter. Others, including Marxists like myself, believe that we'll need a transitional stage between capitalism and communism, a stage called socialism. But hang on a minute, what about communist states? Don't these communist states like the USSR and China contradict everything that's been said so far? Well, communist state is a term pretty much used exclusively by those in the Western world. These countries never called themselves communist states. They call themselves socialists. It's in the name, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The term communist state is also an oxymoron, given that communism is, as we mentioned earlier, a stateless, classless, moneyless society. So, yeah, nice job, Western academic big brains. Now, rather than just seeing communism as a kind of society that we might implement in this country or in that country, it's more useful to understand it as a stage of historical development. We Marxists divide history into a number of stages corresponding to different modes of production. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly we mean by modes of production in the next video. But for now, let's briefly look at the different stages of historical development that we can identify. The first main stage that we can identify is called primitive communism. Think hunter-gatherer societies. The second stage of historical developments that we identify is slave society, such as those seen in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome. Following this, we see the development of feudalism, such as in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. After feudalism, we arrive at capitalism, such as in the modern United States of America. Beyond capitalism, we arrive at socialism, such as what we saw in the USSR and in China. Finally, after a full epoch of socialism, we will arrive at communism. But what does communism actually look like? What would life be like for the average person in the age of communism? In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner. Just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. It'll be a society of abundance with equitable distribution for all. People will work as they're able and receive everything that they require, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Sound utopian? Too good to be true? Well, utopianism is assuming that the planet can sustain capitalism, a system which requires infinite growth on a planet of finite resources. Communists are simply realists who understand that the choice before us is not just between socialism or barbarism, but between socialism or extinction. Now, what exactly does socialism entail as the transitional stage to communism? Well, if you'd like to know the answer to that question and more, stick around. We're going to be fleshing this out over the coming weeks and months ahead. Today we've looked at what communism means as a movement, an ideology, and as a stage in historical development. For more, check the sources and resources in the description box below. Hopefully this video has helped to clarify the term for you a little bit beyond the usual communism as my big government and no food. Thank you for watching this video. If you're able to support this work, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Comrade Romano, Jason, Kayla Schmid, Mamarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Lokishla, Gabriel Bailey, Huge Ass, Ryan Way Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Libertarian Stalinist, Dan Hunter, Sue, Pontus, Colin Walsh, Hagan Michaels, Evan Crossland, Hercule Gorilla, Roja, and Daniel Hamilton. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without you and your ongoing support. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill. Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to spend all our time working for bosses who really just don't give a shit about us beyond our ability to produce profits for them? If we could instead spend our time doing things that actually matter to us. If, in other words, we lived under communism. Well, that's the dream, and we will get there sooner or later. But socialism isn't just going to happen because we think it's this nice, fanciful idea. Rather, socialism is going to happen because there are conflicts within the capitalist mode of production itself that necessitate a progression beyond its limitations. But what is this internal conflict that necessitates socialism? Well, if we want to understand that, we need to first ask, what is a mode of production? Today we're going to take a look at the answer to this question, which will undoubtedly reveal why communism is truly inevitable. Welcome back to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Now, we often hear the term capitalist mode of production, and we may think that this is just a synonym for capitalism, a fancier way of saying it. But if we prod and poke this term just a little bit more, we'll see that it in and of itself reveals the unsustainable nature of this system. So, let's do exactly that. Get the notepads ready. At its most basic form, mode of production simply means the way things are produced, such as the necessities of life like food, housing, clothing, medical equipment, Nintendo, etc. Modes of production within any given society are comprised of two key aspects. One, the productive forces, and two, the relations of production. Have you written that down? No? You're going to regret that later. The first key aspect of the mode of production, the productive forces, is comprised of labour power and the means of production. Now, labour power is not just work, but rather the capacity or the ability to do work. To better understand this, think about the time when you're at work versus the time when you're actually doing work. If you work for an hourly wage, then you're selling your labour power to your boss. Every hour you're selling your capacity to do work. It usually doesn't matter whether you work harder or you do less actual work, you're likely still going to get the same hourly wage. This is because you're not selling your labour directly, you're selling your labour power. which, when you check the notes that you're definitely taking down, you'll remember is your capacity or ability to do work. And this causes a conflict between you and your boss, because you're going to want to do as little work as possible, making it a better deal for you, while they're going to want you to do as much work as possible within that time frame, making it a better and more profitable deal for them. Now, the means of production refers to everything that's required in order to produce, including instruments of production, like the tools, machinery, and buildings in which we carry out our work, as well as subjects of production, which includes natural materials like iron ore, and also materials that have been filtered through previous labour, like that iron ore in its extracted form, which we call raw materials. So when you hear extremely based people saying seize the means of production, that's a call for workers to take control of all that good stuff. The tools, the factories, the raw materials, etc. And to use them for the common good, rather than to further line the pockets of wealthy private capitalists who do none of the actual work. You still with me? I know there was a lot of terminology there, and I know it got maybe a little bit complex, but the good news is that it's all going to be worth it in the end, and we're already over the worst of it. So you can basically relax now. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the productive forces, let's take a look at the second key aspect of modes of production, relations of production. We can easily understand this by simply asking, how do we relate to the process of production? Are we workers in a business generating profit for someone else? Or are we the owners of that business who do little more than simply hoover up the profits that are generated by workers? Under the capitalist mode of production, the relations of production separate society primarily into two classes: based workers, the proletariat, cringe capitalists, the bourgeoisie. We either relate to production as workers, or we relate to production as owners, more specifically, owners of the means of production. Now, there are various subclasses or strata among these two groups, as well as some other classes that we can get into in a later video dedicated specifically to class. But for now, we'll focus on the two main classes of capitalism, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Rather than being a system that benefits everybody equally, the relations of production that we see in capitalism are set up so as to primarily benefit the capitalists to the detriment of the worker. Make no mistake, the capitalist's gain is the worker's loss. The profit they're making is the wealth that you're creating. Never forget that. Now, we'll talk more about the exact process through which the exploitation of labour takes place in a later video specifically about the labour theory of value. But it should already be starting to become clear that there's a definite conflict between the productive forces on one hand and the relations of production on the other, between the interests of labour and the interests of capital, between the working class proletariat and the capitalist bourgeoisie. This conflict must be resolved. It's not going away. And in fact, we see that this conflict is actually intensifying as technology develops. With automation, countless jobs are going to disappear. The development of the productive forces will make the current relations of production upon which capitalism relies completely untenable, with wealth and resources concentrating in fewer and fewer capitalist hands, leaving us, the masses, out of work and unable to access life's necessities. And as nobody will have any money, this in turn is going to mean that the capitalists won't be able to sell their products to anyone. So now we're beginning to see how unstable and ultimately self-destructive this system is. And we're just scratching the surface. We're going to talk a lot more about how capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction in upcoming videos. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. We'll also talk about how we can solve these problems. I'll give you a hint. Class struggle. Lots and lots of class struggle. Today we've looked at the meaning of mode of production, including its two key components, the productive forces and the relations of production. We've looked at how labour power and the means of production constitute the productive forces, and the way in which the based workers and the cringe capitalists embody the relations of production under capitalism. Most importantly, we've looked at how the conflict between productive forces and relations of production forms the economic basis for social revolution, inevitably propelling us from capitalism into socialism, making our apparently utopian dreams into a concrete material reality. Next time, the difference between personal property and private property. Get those two brushes ready. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in some way or another. If you're able to support this work, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napales, Conrad Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Mamarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Lokrislava, Gabriel Bailey, Lepanion, New Jazz, The Royal Way Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Dan Hunter, Soup, Pontus, Colin Walsh, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, Urakui Gorilla, Roja, Daniel Hamilton. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without yous, and I certainly wouldn't be able to pay my bills. Cheers everyone, agus slán actually see you, given that this is YouTube and all. So you could be wearing a tuxedo, or you could be wearing none at all. Stupid sexy Flanders. But bear with me on this one, so we can play out the scenario. I'm going to assume that you, my very attractive friend, are wearing a hat. But not just any hat. The most beautiful hat I've ever seen. Naturally, I'm extremely jealous and want one of my own. Nice hat, I tell you. How much are you going to sell it to me for? To which you respond, very reasonably, like a normal person would. Beck off, Paul. This is my personal property. I'm not selling this. This hat is to be used, not exchanged. Take that commodity trade nonsense elsewhere. As you can imagine, I'm understandably heartbroken at having been shut down like that, and I run home with my tail between my legs. All dreams of ever owning such a beautiful hat like that myself, having been crushed by your cruel, cruel words. But on the way back, I pass by a shop, and I see that very same beautiful hat in the window. Excited, I run inside and I pick it up. But the shop owner is alarmed, and sternly warns me, "Put that hat down. It's the company's private property. If you want it, you're gonna have to pay for it." Now, naturally, I'm baffled. I was assured that this beautiful hat was personal property that was meant to be used. Now I'm being told that it's private property, that if I want access to its warm embrace, then I'm gonna have to exchange money for it. How can it be that the purpose of this beautiful hat for you is use, while for the shop owner its purpose is exchange? That it can be either personal property or private property depending on who owns it and what they're doing with it. Well, let's get to the bottom of this. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. So, we've run into a little bit of difficulty here. This beautiful hat seems to be both personal property and private property. It has use value in its usefulness as a protector of my head against the cruelty of the wind and the rain. But it also has exchange value, in that it can be exchanged for a certain price on the market. Well, in fact, this is one of the most basic building blocks of the capitalist system, the commodity. And the key feature of commodities is that they possess both use value and exchange value. They can be both personal property and private property. However, they're produced primarily for exchange, as private property to make profits for capitalists, and secondarily produced for use, to become personal property. This goes for all commodities produced under the capitalist mode of production, from food to clothes to, you guessed it, Nintendo. If you look at the place you're living right now, whether that's an apartment, a house, or anything else, for you this has use value or usefulness. For you, it's shelter. It keeps you warm, protected. You get to relax with friends and family, get drunk, talk socialism, etc. But your home likely wasn't created primarily for that purpose. It was created primarily to be the private property of the bourgeoisie that would be exchanged and make them more money. Okay, so now we can see that there's a fundamental difference emerging between how the working class proletariat engages with personal property, your home as a place to live, and how the capitalist bourgeoisie engages with private property, that home they acquired solely to make profit. In fact, let's take a moment to clearly map out these differences. In the last video, we talked a little bit about labour power. Now this is also a commodity in that it possesses both use value in its ability to produce, as well as exchange value as capitalists purchase it from us for a certain price in the forms of wages and salaries. For most working class people, we sell our labour power, or commodity, C, to bosses. In return for this, our bosses give us a little bit of money, M. We then take this money that we receive from our wage or salary and use that to purchase commodities, C, for us to use, like food, clothes, toothbrushes, etc. This is the CMC circuit that the working class engages in. We have our commodity, labour power, that we sell for money, and with that money we purchase more commodities, CMC. Capitalists, on the other hand, operate not just on a CMC circuit, but on an inverted MCM circuit. The capitalist circuit begins with money, M, which they use to purchase commodities, C, primarily labour power, in order to get back more money, M. And importantly, that final M includes the initial sum of money invested plus profit that has been generated through labour power. We can signify the presence of this added profit with M prime. Capitalists can then take this profit and use it to purchase more commodities, to get even more profit, to purchase even more commodities, and so on and so on. Okay, take a moment to give yourself an L pat on the back, because you've just learned the general formula of capital, MCM. Now, this is the simplified version of the capitalist circuit. There are a few more steps in between that we'll return to in a later video. We can already see from this that the proletariat on the CMC circuit and the bourgeoisie on the MCM circuit interact quite differently with property. The proletariat acquires personal property exclusively for us to use. The bourgeoisie acquires private property for exchange in order to make profits. Communists seek to abolish private property, not personal property. We seek to abolish exchange value and instead produce entirely for use. To, as the old saying goes, abolish the commodity form. Now, onto the ever-pressing question of toothbrushes. Yes, you get to keep your feckin' toothbrush for personal use. But if there are capitalists who are producing them for profit, for exchange, then you better believe that we're going to hunt them down and redistribute those toothbrushes for the good of the people. The people's toothbrushes. Today we've looked at the differences between personal property and private property. As a general rule, personal property is that property that we possess in order to use. Use value. Private property, on the other hand, is property that's possessed for the purpose of making profits. Exchange value. We've also mapped out the ways in which workers and capitalists relate to commodities, either on the proletarian CMC circuit or the bourgeois MCM circuit, which is the general formula of capital. Next up, that burning question of our time, what is capitalism? Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. For more on housing and the question of use value and exchange value, I strongly recommend checking out the second episode of Space Bacon's Marx in the House series, from which I borrowed quite heavily in this video. Link in the description box below. If you're able to support this work, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napales, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmidt, Marius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Locristula, Gabriel Bailey, The Panion, Hugh Jass, The Runway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Libertarian Stalinist, Soup, Pontus, Colin Walsh, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, Borku Gorilla, Roja, and Daniel Hamilton. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without you, and I certainly wouldn't be able to pay my bills. Cheers everyone, Slán Fo. What is capitalism? Easy. Capitalism is freedom and democracy. Unless we try to use that freedom and democracy to vote in a people-centered government that challenges capitalism in any way. Like in Chile in 1973, when Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president, was ousted from office and replaced by the fascist Augusto Pinochet in a CIA-backed coup. But don't get me wrong, capitalism is freedom and democracy for some people, just not us. Democracy for an insignificant minority. Democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. Normal working people don't get a say on how our workplaces are run, the places where we spend most of our waking lives. We don't get a say in what homes are built where and who gets to live in them. In fact, we don't get a meaningful say in the day-to-day runnings of our societies at all. The only thing we do get is the opportunity to choose a representative of the ruling class once every 4 or 5 years to administer capitalist rule. And if we attempt to venture outside those narrow confines, then you better believe it'll be time for the international capitalist class to mount a CIA-backed coup to bring us even more freedom and democracy. So, let's be honest, capitalism? Not all it's cracked up to be. Now, what the feck is it? Well, let's find out. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Now, so far in this series, we've learned that capitalism is a stage of historical development between feudalism and socialism. We've also talked a bit about capitalism's relations of production. Workers sell their labour power through wage labour, and capitalists purchase this in order to make more profits. From this, we can build a basic understanding of capitalism. Capitalism is a system of private ownership of the means of production for the purpose of extracting profits or surplus value produced by wage labourers. Now, how did we get here? Well, our old friend Karl Marx said that this system becomes inevitable from the moment there is a free sale by the labourer himself of labour power as a commodity. But it is also only from then onwards that commodity production is generalised and becomes the typical form of production. It is only from then onwards that, from the first, every product is produced for sale and all wealth produced goes through the sphere of circulation. Now, under earlier systems like feudalism, there was also a limited amount of simple commodity production. Like if you grew some food for yourself, but you weren't able to eat it all, so you sold the leftovers. But this production under earlier systems was generally for use. Capitalism developed out of feudalism as commodity production started small, but then grew with the rise of the bourgeoisie and became generalized as the typical form of production. To the extent that commodity production, in accordance with its own inherent laws, develops further into capitalist production, the property laws of commodity production change into the laws of capitalist appropriation. As we see this transition from feudalism to capitalism, we also see massive legal changes in society that allow for the free trade of both the means of production and labour power, which itself now becomes a commodity. The capitalist epoch is characterised by the fact that labour power, in the eyes of the worker himself, takes on the form of a commodity which is his property. His labour consequently takes on the form of wage labour. It is only from this moment that the commodity form of the products of labour becomes universal. So when you've got private ownership of the means of production, when you've got generalised commodity production, and when you've got capitalists making profits from workers through wage labour, you've got capitalism. And that can manifest in more of a free market oriented form like in the United States, or a slightly more controlled social democratic form like in Norway. Importantly, governments can and do engage in capitalism themselves, including commodity production, the extraction of surplus value through wage labour, etc. There's a common myth that socialism is when big government does things, making capitalism the opposite of that. But if that were the case, then Saudi Arabia would be socialist with its nationalised oil company and the large public sector. But, as we know, Saudi Arabia is, well, an absolute monarchy that in many ways embodies capitalism taken to many of its natural conclusions. Now, it was mentioned earlier that there are various stages of historical development, but within each stage there are also various sub-stages. Within capitalism, we can identify three main sub-stages. Mercantile capitalism, that emerged from feudalism and primarily focused on controlling national and international trade. Industrial capitalism, which was dominant in the time when Karl Marx himself was writing and was characterised by a much sharper division of labour, heavy machinery, factories and so on. And imperialist capitalism, where capitalism has developed to such a point where capitalist monopolies rule the world. This is the sub-stage that we still live under at the moment. We could go another level deeper again and talk about neoliberal capitalism as a stage within imperialist capitalism, a sub-stage of a sub-stage. But at that point we're mostly just splitting hairs as the underlying mechanisms of imperialist capitalism remain fundamentally unchanged. And don't worry, we're going to talk about all those underlying mechanisms in a later video dedicated specifically to imperialist capitalism. You're going to be sick of hearing about imperialism by the end of this series, if not already. Today we've looked at the meaning of capitalism as a system predicated on private ownership of the means of production, generalised commodity production, and wage labour, through which capitalists make profits from workers. We've also looked at the three main stages of capitalism: mercantile, industrial, and imperialist. We also addressed the idea that capitalism is when small government, freedom, and democracy, which, no, so much no. Next up, what is socialism? Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. If you're able to support this work, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napalis, MLM in Practice, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Mamarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Lokrishla, Gabriel Bailey, Lapanian, Hugh Jass, Royal Way Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Dan Hunter, Soup, Pondus, Colin Walsh, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, Orkua Gorilla, Roja, and Daniel Hamilton. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without yous, and I certainly wouldn't be able to pay my bills. Cheers everyone, agus slán. Sweden, Portugal, Stalin's USSR, Mao's China, revolutionary Catalonia, Norway, all have been described as socialist at different times and by different people. And this causes a lot of problems for us when we're trying to understand what the word socialist means. The word has about 20 different meanings, depending on who you're talking to, generally loosely connected to the idea of worker ownership of the means of production. But it's important to state from the outset that there is no one perfect, universally accepted definition of the word. It's always been a contested term. Following on from this, I can't claim to speak on behalf of social democrats, anarchists, or any kind of right-winger, but what I can do is provide a Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist understanding of it. So, let's find out, what is it from our perspective? Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist Maoist perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. First and foremost, we view socialism as a stage of historical development, specifically the transitional stage between capitalism and communism. Earlier in the writings of Karl Marx, what we're now calling socialism would have been referred to as lower stage communism, while what we've been referring to as communism would have been higher stage communism. It's really from Lenin onwards that we arrive at this tidier separation of the historical stages into capitalism, then socialism, then communism. Now, as socialism is a transitional stage, it's a bit unstable and prone to backsliding into capitalism. In the socialist transition, you're either continuing the class struggle and moving forwards to communism, which we call the socialist road, or you're abandoning the class struggle and backsliding into capitalism, the capitalist road. Importantly, you may reach a stage where you find that you've eliminated classes on paper within your country. Everyone is now legally working class or proletarian. But what about the illegal capitalists on the black market? What about those who've joined your leading communist party but have lingering capitalist ambitions and are working to restore capitalism? What about the bourgeoisie in the surrounding capitalist countries that are trying to destabilize your socialist country? Well, to combat these, we not only continue the class struggle under socialism, but in fact intensify it. And this class struggle continues until classes have been abolished all over the world, when we can finally move to a fully communist, stateless, classless, moneyless society. As much as we'd love to just hit the big red global communism switch, that process doesn't happen overnight, but is much more likely to take centuries to fully complete. Now, let's dial it back a bit and look at the main features of socialism from the ML and MLM perspective. We can loosely group these features under three main categories: the economic aspect, the political aspect, and the transformational aspect. Economically, socialist countries operate under the instruction from each according to their ability to each according to their work. You see the transformation from a capitalist society led by the anarchy of the market with its boom and bust cycles into a rationally planned, centralised economy. This of course eliminates problems like wasteful overproduction as we move towards primarily producing for use rather than production for profit. We see the transformation from private ownership of the means of production to public or state ownership, including nationalisations and collectivisations, under which you gradually see more direct worker control over the means of production develop over time. You also of course have cooperative ownership. And the trajectory for all of these is to progressively transition to the full communal ownership of communism. However, and this is important, this can only help to advance us closer towards a stateless, classless, moneyless society when it's led by the political power of the working class. Which brings us to the second category, the political aspect. Under capitalism, we live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. This means that the capitalists are in charge, that they're the ruling class, whether that's under a liberal democracy or under outright fascism. Socialist societies are politically led by the working class and its genuine representatives. This is called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah, I know, we need a less scary sounding name for it. This is why you'll usually hear us saying something like working class governance instead these days. The governing body must at all times act in the genuine interests of the working class. How do we ensure that the leading Communist Party doesn't just become a group of power-hungry elitists disconnected from the masses, not representing the people? Easy. The leading party stays firmly connected to the masses through the mass line organisational methods. And if the leading party steps out of line, taking the people down a reactionary path, then the empowered masses rise up against the party itself as part of the cultural revolution that sets it back on the revolutionary communist path. Alright, maybe we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Links below for more on those. Finally, the third category is the transformational aspect. Socialism is the transitional stage between capitalism and communism. At all times, the society must be progressing from capitalism towards a stateless, classless, moneyless society. This includes transformation of the relations of production by abolishing the capitalist class, advancing towards the full abolition of the commodity form, winding down production for exchange, phasing out the capitalist law of value, progressively abolishing markets, eliminating wage labour, abolishing private property, moving production to public or cooperative property of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and eventually fully communal property as the capitalist class is abolished, and maintaining the socialist road to communism through cultural revolution, or rather, multiple cultural revolutions. Some, including Marx himself, Also talk about the need for labour vouchers rather than money as we currently understand it in this transformational period, so as to prevent circulation, that MCM capitalist circuit discussed in a previous video, the free purchase of labour power and the means of production, etc. When assessing whether or not a country is socialist, we have to consider all three of these aspects: the economic, the political and the transformational. If it doesn't satisfy all three, we don't consider it socialist. Even societies under the political leadership of a dictatorship of the proletariat that are actively building and transforming themselves towards socialism aren't necessarily socialist until they've also satisfied the economic aspect. See, for example, the new economic policy or NEP period of the USSR after the Bolshevik Revolution, which was state capitalist due to its economic structure before the USSR became actually socialist a number of years later. Likewise, there was a state capitalist period in China after the revolution which declared the People's Republic of China in 1949 before it became properly socialist a number of years later. Today we've looked at the Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist understanding of socialism. It's comprised of three equally important and often overlapping aspects: the economic, the political and the transformational. Without satisfying all three, we are unable to accurately describe society as socialist by this Marxist understanding. That being said, there are certain cases which are extremely clear-cut examples of socialism, like the post-NEP USSR, while there are also many other societies where the legitimacy is genuinely socialist according to these three categories is still fiercely debated among MLs and MLMs. Next up, we'll be diving back into the relations of production as we finally flesh out the answer to the question, what is class? Thank you for watching this video, hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. I am struggling financially at the moment, so please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napalis, Daniel H, MLM in Practice, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmidt, Amarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Loquishla, Gabriel Bailey, Lapanian, Hugh Jass, The Ryan Way Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Soup, Pontus, Colin Welch, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, Borakua Gorilla, and Poster Roman. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without yous. Cheers everyone, agus long fo. Now, you're probably familiar with the mainstream conception of social class that separates people into lower class, middle class, and upper class based on certain income levels. For example, we might think of someone who makes €20,000 per year or less as lower class or working class, €40,000 per year as middle class, and €100,000 per year as upper class. It doesn't matter how you make that money. According to this bourgeois conception, the determinant factor in deciding your class is the quantity of money received. But let's consider two cases of people making €20,000 per year. One is a factory worker, and the other is a small-time landlord who owns a house that they rent out. The factory worker makes their money through working and receiving an hourly wage, while the landlord makes their money from the labour of others, extracted through rent payments. By the earlier mainstream analysis, both should be seen as working class due to their identical income level of €20,000 per year. But when we move to socialism, a society led by and in the interests of the working class, only one of these people is significantly going to benefit: the factory worker. The landlord, on the other hand, is in trouble, because landlordism ends as we progressively abolish private property under socialism, meaning our former landlord is going to have to go and get a job like everyone else. This shows that these two people, the worker and the landlord, have two very different sets of material interests based on how they make their money, despite having identical income levels. The worker is materially incentivized to bring about socialism, drastically improving the conditions for the working class. The landlord is materially incentivized to maintain capitalism, because it's the only way for them to continue to own private property and exploit workers, which is the source of their income. In truth, the two of these people are not members of the same class. One of them, our factory worker, is a member of the working class, while the other, our modern landlord, is a member of the capitalist class. Let's find out why. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and easily digestible videos, usually. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Please share this video around on social media, Discord, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, etc., as the YouTube algorithm is, to speak frankly, thoroughly fecking me over at the moment. Today we're going to talk about social class, first looking at the proletariat, then the bourgeoisie, then the petty bourgeoisie. But I want to give a quick heads up, I'll be providing quite strict definitions of the different classes here. For more advanced viewers who'd like to know why, I'll be explaining this after the main video is finished, which is why you'll see that this video is significantly longer than most of the other videos in this series. Okay, so what is a social class? Classes are large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production, by their relation, in most cases fixed and formulated in law, to the means of production, by their role in the social organisation of labour, and consequently, by the dimensions of the share of social wealth of which they dispose and the mode of acquiring it. Classes are groups of people, one of which can appropriate the labour of another, owing to the different places they occupy in a definite system of social economy. When we talk about class, we're returning to that part of the mode of production called the relations of production, which you may remember from the second video of this series. Class is determined by our concrete relations to the means of production, which leads to certain roles that we fulfill within the productive processes in a given society. Under capitalism, the two main ways that we relate to production are as workers or as capitalists, workers and capitalists being those main roles. And this separates us into two main classes, the working class or proletariat, and the capitalist class or bourgeoisie. Now, let's consult our old friend Friedrich Engels to put some more concrete definitions on these two classes. By bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labour. By proletariats, the class of modern wage labourers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labour power in order to live. That's it. If you own the means of production and the main way you make your money is through purchasing other people's labour power through wage labour, then you're bourgeois. If, conversely, you don't own the means of production and the main way you make your money is through selling your labour power, either through an hourly wage or a salary, then you're proletarian. Simple. At least it's simple until we try to apply it to the real world and see that it's not quite as black and white as it first might seem. As you can imagine, there's a significant difference between a grocery shop worker who receives €20,000 a year from their job and a software developer who receives a salary of €80,000 per year. However, the difference between them is quantitative. That is, it concerns the quantity of money they receive, rather than qualitative, in that they both share the qualities of not owning the means of production and selling their labour power to survive, and therefore both fit Engels' definition of the proletariat. While the grocery shop worker is a standard proletarian, there are also various subclasses or strata within the proletariat to reflect the different conditions of its members. The software developer, like all high-earning professionals who get to enjoy a life of relative luxury under capitalism, belongs to a higher-up subclass or stratum within the proletariat called the labour aristocracy. Now, that's the high end of the proletariat. At the low end we have what's called the lumpen proletariat, which includes people who own no means of production but are often unable to even sell their labour power legally and often end up resorting to a life of petty crime. Think of those who have to resort to robbery, low-level illegal drug dealing and so on in order to survive. So that's the proletariat. Now let's move on to the owning class, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie refers to those who own the means of production and employ wage labour which generates the majority of their income. Think medium and large business owners who make most of their money from other people's labour, not their own. Now, there's a variety of strata within the bourgeoisie that relate quite differently to the global capitalist imperialist system. Some gain from it and support it, such as the imperialists themselves and the comprador bourgeoisie, while others see international capital as a threat to their local business and their livelihoods, such as the national bourgeoisie. But we'll have to return to this topic at a later stage after we've covered imperialism as the current highest stage of capitalism in order to develop a stronger understanding of what all this means. So this understanding of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie all maps on relatively easily to the popular ideas of the rich versus the poor, the 99% versus the 1% and so on. But there's also a group in the middle, between the average proletarian and the average bourgeois. This group is called the petty bourgeoisie. For examples of this, think of a small business owner or an independent tradesperson who makes most of their money through their own labour. And this causes all kinds of headaches for us as Marxists because they own some small quantity of means of production, but the majority of their income doesn't come from them purchasing others' wage labour, but rather from their own labour. And with these characteristics, this group doesn't quite fit Engels' definition of either the proletariat or the bourgeoisie. In fact, it occupies a qualitatively unique position of possessing elements of both the proletariat and the bourgeoisie without fully satisfying the requirements for either one. Now let's put a more concrete definition on it. The petty bourgeoisie is that class which survives primarily by their own labour using their own small means of production. They do not sell their labour power to the capitalists, but neither do they, at least for the most part, exist by hiring wage labour. This would apply to a small business owner who works in their own shop, to a small handicraftsman who sells the products that he creates. It would also apply, for example, to a doctor with their own private practice. Remember, the main source of income for each of these is their own labour rather than the hired wage labour of others. Though there may be a small amount of that involved too, like if the doctor with the private practice has a hired secretary. Okay, so those are the main classes of capitalism. Today we've looked at class or social class, particularly as it presents under capitalism. Of course, different systems have different relations of production and consequently different classes, such as feudalism's peasants and landlords. But under capitalism there are two main classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as well as the petty bourgeois class occupying an unusual position between the two. Within the proletariat, there are also notable subclasses like the lumpen proletariat at the bottom end and the labour aristocracy at the top. Within the bourgeoisie, the most notable subgroups are the national bourgeoisie, the comprador bourgeoisie, and the full-blown imperialist bourgeoisie. It's also important to note that while capitalism dominates the world right now, there are also still remnants of feudal relations of production, which is why you'll still see peasants in many parts of the world. Next up, we're going to zoom out a little bit and answer that question, what is Marxism? Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. I am struggling financially at the moment, so if you're able to, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Roya, Christian DeBalles, Daniel H, MLM in Practice, Roja, Libertarian Stalinist, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmidt, Marius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Luquishleva, Gabriel Bailey, Lepanian, Huge Ass, The Rhineway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Soup, Pontus, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, and Borka Grill. Cheers everyone, August Longfo. Okay, for those still here, the Beginner's Socialism 101 part's over. From here on out, things are going to get slightly more jargony and a lot less aesthetically focused. But here's some footage of dogs to visually occupy things while I talk anyway, because, well, who doesn't love dogs? I want to quickly address some potential concerns that some may have, specifically around how I use the term petty bourgeois, the lack of discussion of the semi-proletariat, the professional managerial class, and so on and so forth. I suspect some may argue that the class analysis put forward in this video is quite narrow and maybe a bit mechanical. I'm going to take a moment to explain why these are the positions I've put forward here in anticipation of some of the responses this video is likely to elicit from some of the more seasoned comrades in the audience. First and foremost, I've been an active Marxist for about 5 years now, and over that time I've been wrong over and over and over again about many different things. I fully accept that I may be wrong about this, and I welcome criticism to help correct this, addressing errors and blind spots so that we can collectively develop the correct position together. So, keeping that in mind, I wanted to explain why I omitted the larger and more expansive definition of the petty bourgeoisie that includes highly paid salaried professionals, many of those with state jobs, people in managerial positions, etc. We can see this definition on Marxist.org, which I'll shorten for brevity's sake. Petty bourgeois. 1. The class of small proprietors, for example owners of small stores, and general handicrafts people of various types. This definition maps onto the definition of petty bourgeois proposed earlier in this video, so we're in line so far. However, then Marxist.org gives a second definition of petty bourgeois that I specifically didn't put forward in this video. 2. The petty bourgeoisie also refers to the growing group of workers whose function is management of the bourgeois apparatus. These workers do not produce commodities, but instead manage the production, distribution, and/or exchange of commodities and/or services owned by their bourgeois employers. While these workers are part of the working class because they receive a wage and their livelihood is dependent on that wage, they are separated from working class consciousness because they have day-to-day control, but not ownership, over the means of production, distribution, and exchange. So there are a few serious issues with this definition. It appears to erroneously make consciousness the determining factor of a person's class, completely overriding their objective material relations to the means of production. This definition concedes that they are workers and are a part of the working class, but we don't consider them working class because somehow their subjective consciousness separates them from the rest of the proletariat, which stems from the privilege they experience relative to other workers as a result of having some measure of control over the means of production, though not ownership of the means of production. This poses a problem for Marxists as materialists, because this appears to be a philosophically idealist understanding of class. Class here is being determined more by one's thoughts and consciousness rather than their objective material conditions. It places primacy on the ideas rather than on the material. For while the individuals in these positions may be more prone to being ideologically aligned with the bourgeoisie, they are still materially proletarian, as this definition even concedes. And we are materialists, so we have to try our best to begin our analysis with material reality, rather than on one's notions about themselves, which may lead to false consciousness. As Scott Harrison says in his essay, Comments on the Term Petty Bourgeoisie, when writing about this very topic, there's blatant confusion between the petty bourgeois ideology of one section of the working class with what actual social class they should be considered to be objectively a part of. The MLM goal, at least, is to define social classes on the basis of the different and distinct relationships that specific groups of people have to the means of production. Thus, as the proletariat, working class, bourgeoisie, capitalist class, and petty bourgeoisie, sometimes incorrectly identified with what is currently known as the middle class, should be properly defined, each is quite distinct and separate from the others. Yes, individuals may be part of one of these classes in some respects and part of another in other respects. A worker may own some small number of shares of stock, for example, but the classes themselves must be different and distinct, and their definitions must not overlap. And specifically, those in each class should share a common relationship to the means of production that is not included in the definitions of other classes. If this condition is abandoned, social classes lose most of their analytical usefulness, as indeed has happened to the quintessential bourgeois term, middle class. If we return to Engels' definition of the proletariat put forward earlier on, the class of modern wage labourers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labour power in order to live, we can see very clearly that all of the people who are considered petty bourgeois employees, such as public school teachers, supervisors, etc., 100% meet these criteria. They don't own the means of production, and they're forced to sell their labour power through wage labour in order to survive. Conversely, they don't have anything to do with the definition of the bourgeoisie as the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labour. They're none of those things. They aren't the exploiters, although it is true that some of them, including supervisors and managers, play a role in increasing the level of exploitation that occurs in order to maximise profits for the capitalists. So, I argue that we need to have a clear and concrete definition of classes that's rooted primarily in material reality. And this isn't to deny the importance of understanding how some sections of the proletariat may be more amenable to revolutionary ideology, while others may be more prone to identifying with reactionary bourgeois ideology or harbour bourgeois consciousness. We absolutely need to study all of these phenomena in great depth. But our analysis must always, as materialists, be primarily rooted in material reality. And as such, our analysis must begin with one's objective material conditions, one's concrete relations to the means of production. And from there, we can build on that and develop a deeper understanding of false consciousness and how bourgeois ideology has penetrated many strata of the proletariat. But as materialists, we need to be able to clearly delineate between people's ideologies and consciousness on one hand, and their objective class position based materially on their relations to the means of production on the other. I want to take a moment to say that this question of whether or not these workers are part of the proletariat is of great importance to us as socialists. Under the transition period of socialism, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, one of our main tasks is to abolish the bourgeoisie, to assimilate them to the proletariat. As everyone is then proletarian, there's no longer class distinction, and the proletariat thus abolishes itself as we reach the classless society of communism. Now, under the socialist transition period, categorising teachers and doctors and other professionals as bourgeois or petty bourgeois causes us an immediate problem, because our task as the dictatorship of the proletariat would then be to abolish them with the rest of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie. As we can imagine when we think this through to the socialist transition period, it's quite detrimental to the development of socialism to identify them as bourgeois or petty bourgeois. Simply put, using one concrete example, we need doctors. We most definitely should not be trying to abolish them. Now, regarding the so-called professional managerial class, or PMC, I made a video about this some time back, laying out many of the problems that have been discussed here, namely that it's just not a class from a Marxist materialist perspective, while still accepting that we do need to understand the unique features of these groupings as part of the proletariat. As for the semi-proletariat, I don't see the necessity of this term. To the best of my knowledge, it appears to refer mostly to the lowest sections of the petty bourgeoisie, who are themselves deeply exploited and in many cases in worse off positions materially than the average proletarian. And this state of being deeply exploited is suggested to give these people a kind of proletarian consciousness, meaning think their interests more closely align with the interests of the proletariat than the bourgeoisie. This falls into the same trap mentioned earlier, where better-off sections of the proletariat are considered petty bourgeois based on their consciousness, their ideology, and their political inclinations. And, though in reverse this time, this still gives primacy to ideas and consciousness over material reality. This group is objectively petty bourgeois in that they, to return to the earlier definition, survive primarily on their own labour, using their own small means of production. They don't sell their labour power to the capitalists, nor do they exist for the most part by hiring wage labour. Nonetheless, they are extremely exploited and oppressed in various ways. I would therefore suggest that it's better that we can clearly delineate their objective position as part of the petty bourgeoisie, while also acknowledging that they are extremely likely to have what we might call proletarian consciousness, and are consequently very likely to be allies to the proletarian revolution. Okay, so those are my positions right now. Hopefully that explains my thinking a bit and helps to clarify why I left these categorizations out of the initial Socialism 101 part of this video. However, and this is really important, people far smarter and more well-read than me do sometimes use these more expansive categorizations. People who are actual authority figures in the international communist movement. Mao, for example, can be seen referring to the semi-proletariat in analysis of the classes in Chinese society. In the same text, he also calls primary and secondary school teachers petty bourgeois. You can see that he uses a more expansive definition of petty bourgeois than I used in the initial video here. So the comrades who argue in favour of this expanded definition will find plenty of justification for doing so among the greats. However, warning, hot take coming here, the fact that one of the great communists said this doesn't necessarily make it objectively true for us as scientific socialists. To claim that it does would be to treat these figures theologically, and would certainly be falling into the trap of dogmatic book worship. So, in that spirit, we should be open to respectfully disagreeing with these figures if we ever feel they're incorrect, or perhaps if their analysis was correct for the particular time and context in which they were writing, but is no longer true or applicable to the modern world. Scott Harrison's essay touches on this a bit more, so I'd strongly recommend if comrades are interested in the arguments that I've been putting forward in the latter section of this video, then they should absolutely read that essay and engage with it more there. Again, before we wrap up, I want to stress that I may be wrong about all this. It may be the case that in a few months or a year, comrades will help me to realise the errors in this analysis, in which case I'll make a part 2 to this video correcting those mistakes. I want to give a massive thanks to MLM in Practice for talking me through this conversation in depth, offering that alternative, expansive perspective. I suspect this fantastic comrade will at some stage make a Paul Moran is wrong about class video to rival the mighty work of Premier Lyles, and I very much look forward to continuing the conversation on this topic and developing a clear analysis collectively. I also want to thank Roymere, Vujko and the Peace Report for sending on materials which have helped to expand my understanding of this topic, whether or not we've necessarily come to the same conclusions on it. I especially welcome all of your contributions and criticisms of this video. Thank you very much, comrades. Cheers everyone, Agus Long of all. What is Marxism? Isn't that just the same thing as communism? Or socialism? Maybe? Well, thankfully, you don't need to worry about questions like these because you've already watched the previous episodes of this series which explain those terms. And you know that socialism and communism are stages of historical development which come after feudalism and capitalism. And since you've been studiously following this series, you've already been learning Marxist theory, from understanding modes of production, to property, to social classes, and everything else covered thus far. Give yourself a pat on the back, you're killing it. But it's the 7th episode in, and we still haven't defined what Marxism actually is. So, let's go ahead and do exactly that. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Please share this around on social media as the YouTube algorithm is thoroughly fecking me over at the moment. Now, Marxism's a tricky thing to define because there are so many different facets to it that no one single short definition will ever be sufficient. So, the purpose of this video is not to provide one perfect definition, but rather to briefly introduce some of the major Marxist concepts and provide a basic backdrop so that we can dive into each of these individually in much greater detail in later videos. Marxism on one hand refers simply to a body of thought, the political and economic theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. On the other hand, Marxism is an all-encompassing worldview. an ever-expanding theoretical toolbox that empowers us to look behind the curtains, unveiling the hidden processes which have given rise to all that we see before us, and to consequently more deeply understand the very nature of reality itself. But, let's be honest, this explanation conceals more than it reveals, and that's not good enough because one of the main purposes of Marxism is to demystify and to help us see clearly. However, Marxism isn't just another philosophy, despite regular claims to the contrary. Where philosophy seeks only to analyse and understand, Marxism is a scientific theory that generates revolution and propels society forward to its next historical stage. But long before we arrive at the inevitable conclusion of the working class rising up to overthrow the capitalists who've been robbing us of the surplus value that we've generated through our labour, which they call their profits, we need to understand that Marxism is, at its most basic level, simply a method of analysis. This method is rooted in what's called dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism consists of two components, dialectics and materialism. Dialectics is the analysis of contradictions, or conflicting opposing forces, and how these contradictions drive change. Materialism refers to where our analysis begins, with matter, atoms, scientifically verifiable, concrete material reality. This is opposed to beginning with ideas, or religious or spiritual notions. Knowledge isn't handed down from the heavens, but rather built up from the ground. The application of dialectical materialism to world history and societal development is called historical materialism. Now, when Marxists talk about Marxism, at its core, this is the method that we're generally referring to, historical materialism. Through this method, we can understand that the contradictions within societies, and more precisely the class contradictions, become the motor for social historical transformation. Arising from these class contradictions is class struggle, and it's this conflict which propelled us from slave society to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, and what gets us from capitalism to socialism. A modern example of a class contradiction would be between the working class or proletariat and the capitalist class or bourgeoisie. The working class generates value through their labour, while the capitalists appropriate a large portion of that value created. What capitalists call their profits is really just stolen surplus value that workers have generated. Capitalists seek to extract as much surplus value from workers as possible, while workers seek to end this exploitation and receive the full value created by their labour. This is a contradiction inherent to the capitalist system that can only be resolved by moving towards the next stage of social historical development, socialism. How do we get to socialism? The same way we got from feudalism to capitalism. The only way that's ever successfully progressed society from one system to the next. The revolutionary overthrow of the exploiters by the exploited, thus resolving the class contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, propelling history forward to its next stage. There's a lot to unpack in what's just been said, but don't worry because we're going to flesh this all out a lot more in the next video, which is going to be dedicated specifically to dialectical and historical materialism. Now, beyond the core of dialectical and historical materialism upon which everything else is built, Marxism can also refer to a number of other concepts developed by Marx and Engels, most notably including the Marxist law of value, which, to oversimplify, reveals that the value of a commodity, manifested in its exchange value as opposed to its use value, is determined by the socially necessary labour time that it takes to produce it. Base and superstructure, which reveal the way in which the economic base of a society, in our case the capitalist mode of production, gives rise to the superstructure of society, which then in turn helps to reinforce that base. Examples of the superstructure would include things like the state and other political structures, the law, the media, art, the education system, religious institutions, and even ideologies themselves, which all help to reinforce that economic base, which in turn reinforces the superstructure, and so on and so forth. Commodity fetishism, which reveals the way in which the commodities that we encounter on the market mystify us and obscure the real human relations which were involved in the creation of these commodities. For example, it's often nearly impossible for us to know the workers in the sweatshops and the conditions under which the products we encounter on the market have been created. Thus, the real social relations between people ourselves are hidden, and in its place appear to us merely relations between things, those things generally being the money in our pocket and the product on that shelf. Marxism also includes his theory of alienation, which describes the various ways that working people become alienated, that is, separated or detached, through the process of capitalist production, particularly in how the products of a worker's labour don't belong to the worker themselves, but instead belong to the capitalist who pays that worker's wage or salary. Now, these are all massive oversimplifications, but don't worry because we're going to dive into each one in much greater detail over the next few videos. Importantly, all of these Marxist concepts coalesce and reveal to us the unsustainable nature of capitalism from a thorough analysis of class society in its totality. And not only do they diagnose the problems, they also provide the solution to resolve the contradictions inherent to capitalism. Today we've looked at the key components of Marxism. We've gone directly to its core by touching on dialectical materialism and its application to socio-historical development, historical materialism. We've briefly dipped our toes into the waters of the Marxist law of value, basin superstructure, commodity fetishism, and Marxist theory of alienation. And we've set the backdrop for studying these Marxist concepts and more in greater depth in the upcoming videos. One last thing. It should also be pointed out that Marxism is a developing scientific theory. Since the time of Marx's writing, it's been greatly built upon, developed, and expanded through the rich experiences of real-world class struggle. World historical socialist revolutions have led to qualitative leaps forward in Marxist theory. In light of Russia's Bolshevik Revolution, it progressed from Marxism to Marxism-Leninism. And in light of the Chinese Revolution, it progressed from Marxism-Leninism to Marxism-Leninism-Maoism. But what do each of these theoretical developments entail? Well, those are topics for more advanced parts of this series. But for now, it'll suffice to say that Marxism is not something that stuck in the 1800s or even the 1900s, but is instead a theoretical method that's always growing by learning from its failures and building upon its successes, right up to this very day. Next up, we're going to dive back into dialectics and deepen our understanding of historical materialism. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. I am struggling financially at the moment, so if you're able to, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Christian Nabalis, Daniel H, MLM in Practice, Jason, Michaela Schmidt, Amarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Loquishleve, Lepanium, Hugh Das, The Runway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Soup, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, and Borgo Gorilla. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without you. Cheers everyone, agus slán fó. Dialectical materialism is the philosophical underpinning of Marxism. This foundational part of Marxism requires a significant amount of attention and study.
Same time tomorrow.